At around 20 past 2 in the morning, April 15th, 1912, the stern of Titanic disappeared for good beneath the icy black Atlantic, leaving hundreds of people behind, alive and dead. For the survivors, huddled cold under blankets in lifeboats or clinging desperately to an overturned collapsible raft, the night suddenly fell silent, and all there was to do was wait. The hours must have felt like years. In fact, few people who have ever inhabited this planet can ever relate to what those 2,200 souls experienced that night. But unfortunately, for all those who endured and fought through those tragic moments that early morning, their story had only really just begun. While many would be greeted by immense generosity upon their arrival in New York, survivors would be forced to recount their terrible experiences time and time again for inquiries and legal battles. Crew members would try to fight for fair compensation. Steerage passengers would be nearly all but forgotten. The days, weeks, months and years following the Titanic sinking are one of the great untold aspects of the disaster, and the ship caused a momentous ripple through time that affected the lives of hundreds, even thousands around the world. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs, and this is the story of what happened after the Titanic sank. For hours, Titanic's weary survivors were tossed around on the Atlantic on their small wooden boats, totally unsure of their own safety. Just because they had escaped the sinking ship didn't mean they would survive the night, or even the next few days. But at long last, on the horizon, a light was spotted low, a ship. When Cunard's RMS Carpathia picked up the 700 plus survivors, the first urgent task was to treat the sick and the wounded. These passengers had sat still in the frigid air of a cold April night in the Atlantic, and some had been exposed to 28°F, minus 2°C water. The crew of the Carpathia was well staffed to address sick and wounded passengers with 3 physicians on board. Thanks to the Herculean efforts of her captain and crew, supplies were quickly gathered and they established makeshift first aid stations in each of the ship's 3 dining saloons that triaged the survivors and dealt with the most serious cases. There were broken bones, fractures and bruises, fainting, convulsions, and delirium. For some unfortunates, frostbite had begun to creep up their toes and feet. Carpathia steamed on for New York with her cargo of bewildered people, and life could never be the same again. As news of Titanic's demise reached American shores, New Yorkers sprung into action to prepare for the arrival of the wounded. When Carpathia arrived at the port of New York, on the evening of April 18th, 20 ambulances from Bellevue and the Metropolitan Hospital on Blackwell's Island were parked near the pier on East 26th Street, ready to transport the seriously ill and injured survivors at a moment's notice. The ferryboat Thomas S. Brennan was also docked nearby, equipped as a hospital ship, ready to receive and treat those that needed medical attention most urgently. Dozens of survivors were transported to St. Vincent's Hospital, which was run by the Sisters of Charity. New York had prepared to deal with the worst-case scenario, the likely possibility that all 2,200 or so of Titanic's passengers and crew would need urgent care, but instead, only around 700 people disembarked Carpathia. In addition to the many medical staff and the transports, survivors on Carpathia were greeted by the Women's Relief Committee with food, clothing, and emergency funds, while the Travelers' Aid Society and the Council of Jewish Women stationed themselves at the pier and guided mostly second and third class survivors to temporary and safe lodging inside the city. It wasn't just government or official organisations either. Locals started to take the steps to make sure that survivors would have what they needed for long-term care and support as well. In fact, the Women's Relief Committee was formed by some of the city's most prominent female figures who took to action at a blistering pace, coming up with a comprehensive plan for providing critical services and resources for surviving passengers, especially immigrants who'd travelled third class. The problem was that hundreds and hundreds of these people had simply lost literally everything they owned and were now washed up in a foreign country with nothing to their names and nowhere to go. Many had lost husbands, sons, and brothers. News of Titanic's loss crackled through telegraphs around the world. Back in England, the Lord Mayor of London commissioned the Titanic Relief Fund that spring. It aimed to support the families of victims in cities hit the worst with loss of life. In Southampton, for example, no fewer than 549 were lost, a devastating statistic that left hundreds of working-class families without breadwinners. Virtually an entire generation of Southamptoners was lost that night in the North Atlantic, and those they left behind needed help. Many families received benefits from the council to help them recover. In the end, the fund raised over $161,000 for Titanic survivors and families of the victims, and the British component raised over $2 million. Amazingly, the Titanic Relief Fund operated for decades and actually didn't close operations until 1959, where many of the children the foundation had helped had grown to adulthood and were finally able to support themselves. Many women made widows by the Titanic disaster were also able to stand on their own 2 feet, and some had remarried. The charity provided by many countless strangers for Titanic survivors was a dramatic display of human compassion and kindness. While the donations and relief efforts from strangers were overwhelmingly generous and definitely uplifted the spirits of survivors, it didn't mean their ties with the White Star Line were over. In fact, for many, it was just the start of a multi-year journey with Titanic's owners because hundreds were rightfully seeking compensation. When most people boarded a lifeboat that terrible night, they had no thoughts that it would be the last time they'd step foot on Titanic. Most thought the evacuation was just a proactive measure. For dozens, it was only after rowing away from the ship that they noticed her bow was low down in the water. Many brought very little with them. When the ship sank, down with her went belongings, artifacts, prized possessions, and family heirlooms. Naturally, the question arose: when a ship sinks and there's a loss of life, how do you determine who's at fault and responsible for that person's passing? Tickets sold for White Star Line voyages had a broad disclaimer that said, neither the ship owner, agent, or passage broker shall be liable to any passenger carried under this contract for loss, damage, or delay to the passenger or his baggage arising from the act of God, public enemies, arrests or restraints of princes, rulers, or people, fire, collisions, stranding, perils of the sea, rivers, or navigation of any kind, even though the loss, damage, or delay may have been caused or contributed to by the neglect or default of the ship owner's servants or other persons for whose acts he would otherwise be responsible. It's jargon that few migrants would have properly read through, if they could read at all. But despite the clause, survivors and families of victims were going to look for someone to take responsibility for their losses. Incredibly, the White Star Line filed a petition in the Southern District of New York in October 1912 to limit its liability against any claims for loss of life, property, or injury, the very 3 things survivors and families of victims would be filing suit over in short order. The company claimed that the collision was due to a so-called inevitable accident, that at the time Titanic's liability was protected by an 1851 law that stated in cases of unavoidable accidents, the company was not liable for any loss of life, property, or injury. If the captain and the crew made an error that led to a disaster, but the owner was not aware of it, the company's liability was limited to the total of the passengers' fares alone, the amount paid for cargo, and any salvaged materials recovered from the wreck. The law was passed to encourage shipbuilding and trade by minimizing the risk to owners when disasters occurred. Under this law, the White Star Line would only be liable for a grand total of $91,805, which amounts to nearly $3 million today. $85,212 for passenger fares, $2,073 for cargo, and $4,520 for materials salvaged from the recovered lifeboats. But despite the White Star Line's claiming that the disaster was within the perimeter of the law, individuals seeking payments slowly began to build their cases. They claimed that although the crew had received wireless messages warning of ice, the ship maintained her speed, stayed on the same northerly course, posted no additional lookouts, and failed to provide the lookouts themselves with binoculars. They also faulted the White Star Line, and rightly so, for not drilling the crew properly for evacuation, leading to the launch of partially filled lifeboats. For the time, these were all very fair arguments. In a previous video on this channel, we looked at the breakup of Titanic and how dark it was that night, and we looked at the fact that binoculars probably really wouldn't have made a huge difference in these kinds of conditions. But the lookouts should have had them anyway, and it was up to the captain, his officers, and critically, the owners to ensure that they were properly equipped. After the White Star Line filed its petition, notices were posted in the New York Times between October 1912 and January 1913, asking people who claimed damages to prove their claims by April 15th, 1913, the 1-year anniversary of the ship's sinking. Hundreds of claims totaling over $16 million came from people from all around the world. They were divided into 4 groups: loss of life, loss of property, loss of life and property, and injury and property. Now, the injury and property category stands out in particular because the claims detail the nightmarish experience of many survivors. In nearly 50 claims, survivors describe how they lived through the disaster and the physical and mental injuries they sustained. Anna McGowan, sailing on Titanic to return home to Chicago, wasn't able to get on a lifeboat cleanly and she was forced to jump. She sustained permanent injuries from the fall, from shock, and subsequent frostbite. Bertha Noon filed suit for more than $25,000 thanks to injuries she sustained after being physically pushed onto a lifeboat and her exposure to the cold water for several hours. She listed a badly injured back and spine that left her unable to wear corsets, severe nervous shock, and a misplaced womb. Additionally, she suffered from recurring congestion in her head and chest that left her prone to waves of unconsciousness for days at a time. The claims for loss of property really emphasised the class differences between different survivors on Titanic. Margaret Maggie Brown, for example, one of Titanic's most famous survivors, and today known as Molly, made claims in excess of $27,800 alone. Her claim listed a loss of multiple furs, gowns, capes, dresses, and a $2,000 necklace. Irene Harris, the widow of Broadway producer and theatre owner Henry Harris, sought a $1 million claim. Then there was the Carters, as we covered in a previous video on Lost Treasures of Titanic. They had a brand new 1912 Renault on board. Carter filed a claim on the Renault with Lloyd's of London, seeking $5,000 reimbursement from the White Star Line. By contrast, in perhaps the most modest of claims, third-class passenger and survivor Yum Hee filed a claim for items totaling just $91.05. The most expensive thing? A suit valued at £2.5, clearly a far cry from a French automobile or fine jewellery, and a perfect demonstration of the massive gulf between Edwardian rich and poor. Hearings for the lawsuits weren't held until June 1915 in the Southern District of New York. Depositions filed with the court through 1913 and 1914 show conflicting reports on who to blame for the disaster. In June 1914, Bruce Ismay, White Star Line's chairman at the time of the disaster, was once again questioned on the speed of Titanic, the lifeboats, the lookouts, and other issues that may have contributed. Just as he had in the inquiries held in the days and weeks following the sinking, he reiterated that all decisions were made by Captain Smith, and he was just aboard as a passenger. A claim which is, technically, correct, but the real truth is that no chairman of a company could ever truly board his ship and be treated as just another passenger, and of course, Smith wasn't alive to defend himself. Outrageously, the British inquiry held in 1912 had come to its own ridiculous conclusions, particularly the point that there was, apparently, no structural reason that any class of passengers had less of an opportunity than those from another class to reach the deck and the lifeboats, even though third class were berthed hundreds of feet away and stories below the boat deck itself. More survivor eyewitness accounts gave more insight into the dramatic and final moments of the ship. And while these testimonies continued for several days in June and July 1915, negotiations were being carried on outside of court that led to a settlement with nearly all claimants in December that year. Judge Julius M. Mayer signed a final decree in July 1916, which held the company guiltless of any probability and knowledge, and thus not liable for any loss, damage, injury, destruction, or fatalities. In the end, the company paid a total settlement of just over $600,000 to be divided amongst all the claimants, a far, far cry from the original $16 million. It was one of the great injustices of maritime law. For surviving passengers, the ordeal would never really truly leave them. Some would speak of it publicly, and others would hold it secret even from their own families. But what about Titanic's surviving crew members? How could they continue with their lives and their careers? Life at sea had some strange peculiarities back then, one of which meant that their wages stopped as soon as Titanic sank at 2:20 a.m. It was an era of bureaucratic indifference. The most extreme example of this concerns the band. In one very famous case, musician Jock Hume's parents were outraged when CW and FN Black, the agent that contracted musicians to Oceanliners, sent a note asking after a 14 shilling 7 pence debt for the uniform that had been lost with their son. Instead of paying it back, Jock's father sent the note to the Amalgamated Musicians Union to publish in their newsletter. For most of Titanic's crew, this was the stark reality, and the survivors had to get back to business. Many went to work right away, with some even finding jobs aboard Titanic's sister Olympic. Then there were the officers. After the inquiries concluded, they ended up charting very similar careers, but the spectre of Titanic's loss never really left them. Second Officer Lightoller was the highest-ranking surviving crew member. He lived through the night by balancing on an overturned, collapsible lifeboat and was a powerful voice in the Titanic inquiries, incorrectly testifying that the Titanic did not break in two during her sinking, and he stayed a devout company man to the last. After the disaster, he served as a mate on the Oceanic, returning to duty with the White Star Line, and a year later he received a promotion from sub-lieutenant to full lieutenant in the Royal Navy Reserve. He was called up to active duty with the Royal Navy at the outbreak of the First World War. He was shipwrecked again, and in 1915 was given his own command, the torpedo boat HMTB 117. His wartime career was marred in controversy after the sinking of a U-boat. Reportedly, his crew fired on German survivors in the water, violating the conventions of war. He was placed on the retired list in March 1919 with the rank of commander, and in retirement, Lightoller took odd jobs like innkeeper, chicken farmer, and property speculator. But he was later involved in the Dunkirk evacuation, charging off across the channel to help bring the boys back. He was a real character, and he died in 1952, having never commanded his own passenger ship. Third Officer Herbert Pittman continued to serve with the White Star Line too after the Titanic. He served on Oceanic and then Olympic, but thanks to failing eyesight, he was taken from the bridge and made a purser instead. He left the White Star Line in 1922 for Shaw Saville, but he also never commanded his own passenger ship. Fourth Officer Joseph Boxall served again in the same position on White Star Line's Adriatic before he was promoted to lieutenant in the Royal Navy Reserve in May 1915. He served a year aboard the battleship HMS Commonwealth during the First World War, before being dispatched to Gibraltar, where he would command a torpedo boat. After the war, Boxall returned to the White Star Line in 1919, and eventually signed on as second officer on Olympic. Finally, when White Star Line and Cunard merged in 1933, Boxall served as first and later chief officer of the RMS Aquitania, and after 41 years at sea, he retired in 1940. Finally, there was Fifth Officer Harold Lowe. He served with the Royal Navy Reserve during the First World War as well, eventually attaining the rank of lieutenant. Lowe returned to serve with the White Star Line before retiring in 1931, but as with the other surviving officers, not one of them ever held their own passenger ship command, with White Star or any other line. Such was the cloud that loomed over them, the legacy of Titanic's loss. The aftermath of Titanic's sinking is a demonstration of the strange duality of society, where survivors were lavished with aid by total strangers in the immediate aftermath. On arrival at New York, they were kicked to the curb by courts and inquiries for years after. The British inquiry didn't even bother to interview a single third-class passenger, and yet it came to the conclusion they had just as good a chance as first class at getting into a boat, never mind the fact their survival rate was less than half that of their supposed social betters. For those that survived the Titanic disaster or those who lost loved ones during the sinking, the sad fact of the matter is that it would be part of their lives forever. Much of it would be under the exposure of the public eye, testifying at inquiries, giving interviews to the press, and filing lawsuits against the White Star Line. But for others, the trauma manifested in private. Survivor Frank Goldsmith couldn't take his children to a baseball game because the roar of the crowd reminded him too much of the screams of the hundreds left behind in the water once Titanic sank. When tragedy strikes, surviving the actual event is usually just one in a long series of harrowing and difficult steps. Survivors are not only forced to recollect the value of their lost possessions, but to try to put a price on the loss of lives. And really, just how is anybody supposed to do that? Ladies and gentlemen, it's your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel because we get new videos out weekly. If you want to support my work and get really cool perks like behind the scenes and early access, please visit my Patreon in the link in the description below, or sign up as a YouTube member. Come and join the crew. As always, stay safe, stay happy, and I'll see you again next time.